The valley is quiet now, choked by vines and shadow, but the wind still seems to whisper her name. Locals say it's cursed ground, where even birds refuse to sing and the soil never truly settles. The cabin that once stood there was built by the McCrees, a family that vanished without explanation more than half a century ago. What little remains, splintered wood, rusted tools, a child's shoe half buried in the mud, tells a story no one dares to speak aloud. It began with the patriarch, a man of faith so devout it warped into madness. He read scripture by candlelight, twisting its meaning until his family believed isolation was salvation. No one came in, and no one left. When the girl was born, her mother's eyes were hollow, and her father's were filled with something darker than fear. As the years passed, the girl grew under her grandfather's watchful eye, never permitted to speak to outsiders, never allowed beyond the ridge. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of her, a pale figure at the tree line, watching, silent. But then the winter came when her mother disappeared. And from that moment, the girl's laughter, once faintly heard through the trees, was gone. The first screams came 3 years later. They carried through the valley like a banshee's wail, sharp and unending, and those who heard them swore the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. By dawn, the cries had stopped. The cabin windows were dark. And when a search party finally went to investigate, all they found was blood on the floorboards and a cradle rocking by itself. No one speaks of the McCree cabin now. But on certain nights, when the fog drifts low and the moon hides its face, travelers say they can hear a lullaby echoing from the ridge, a voice soft and cracked, singing to something that should never have been born. In the shadowed heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there exists a legend so deeply buried in shame and secrecy that even those who still whisper it do so behind closed doors. They call her the Forbidden Daughter, though her real name has been lost to time, replaced by a chilling tale that has haunted the region for generations. It's said that she bore a child not by chance or seduction, but by the hand of her own grandfather, a man whose authority and delusion twisted the very fabric of their bloodline. The story is never told in full, only in fragments passed from one trembling mouth to another, as if speaking it too clearly might bring her spirit back from whatever pit of sorrow it was cast into. The locals say the story began in a secluded valley, one untouched by roads or modern light, where faith and fear intertwined like the roots of ancient trees. In those mountains, families lived far apart, isolated by both geography and pride. The McCree family was one of the most secretive, building their home deep in the woods where no law or preacher dared to wander. They were known to keep to themselves, attending no church, hosting no visitors, and keeping their kin close, too close, some would later say. As years went on, rumors spread through the nearby towns about strange noises at night, and a girl's faint singing that drifted through the fog like a haunting melody. Those who ventured near the McCree property often felt an unnatural stillness, as though the forest itself were listening. Hunters spoke of seeing candlelight flicker through boarded windows, and of hearing a man's voice preaching loudly into the darkness, reciting verses that didn't sound like any scripture they knew. But what disturbed them most was the child, pale as ash, with eyes that seemed older than her years, standing silently in the doorway as if guarding something the world was never meant to see. As the story passed down, the details changed, but the warning remained the same: something unholy happened in that cabin. Some say it began when the old man proclaimed himself chosen by God to purify his family's blood, to keep their lineage untainted by the outside. Others claim he lost his mind after his wife died, consumed by a madness that turned sacred love into sin. Whatever the truth, the whispers endured. The Forbidden Daughter became more than just a victim of her grandfather's cruelty, she became a ghostly reminder of what happens when isolation breeds delusion and faith turns to darkness. Even now, when fog settles over the hollows, old folks cross themselves and say her name isn't to be spoken, lest the mountains remember her and the curse begin again. The cabin still stands, though the woods have all but swallowed it. Locals say it's cursed, that the trees themselves bend away from it as though even nature refuses to touch the place. It was built long before anyone can remember, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains where the fog hangs thick and daylight struggles to break through. No road leads to it now, only a narrow path, half hidden by overgrowth and time, winding through silence so heavy it feels alive. It was here, in that lonely clearing, that 3 generations of one family lived and died, cut off from the rest of the world by choice and by madness. The McCrees called it home, though there was nothing warm or welcoming about it. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of rough timber blackened by smoke and age. Its single chimney leaned slightly, as if tired of standing guard over so many secrets. Inside, the air was always thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood. There were only 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for everything else. Windows were boarded, not for warmth, but to keep eyes from looking in or out. Some said the old man, the patriarch, believed the outside world carried sin, that the light itself could corrupt his family. Others whispered he was hiding something far darker than faith could justify. Life in that cabin followed its own rules. There was no church, no school, no doctor to visit. Everything the family needed came from the land, or from each other. They hunted, they farmed a little, and they prayed, always prayed. But their prayers were not like others. They were quiet, murmured things, spoken in candlelight while shadows crawled across the walls. The grandfather's voice carried through the night sometimes, rising and falling in strange rhythm, quoting verses that made the neighbors' skin crawl when they heard them echo across the valley. The girl, barely more than a child, grew up surrounded by that isolation. The forest was her only witness, the cabin her cage. To her, the outside world was something she only imagined: the sound of birds, the shape of a river, the sight of strangers passing through. The few who had seen her said she looked lost even when she stood still, her eyes darting toward the trees as though she could hear something calling beyond them. But she was never allowed to answer that call. Every time she wandered too far, the old man would find her and drag her back, whispering that everything she needed was already within those walls. That was the cabin's curse, not its decay or its darkness, but the way it convinced those inside that nothing existed beyond it. He ruled the cabin like a king without a crown, a man whose word was law and whose faith had turned into something unrecognizable. The grandfather was not born cruel, or so the few surviving townsfolk claim, but years of isolation and obsession had hollowed him out. What began as stern devotion became a fever that consumed him, a belief that he alone understood God's will. He twisted scripture to fit his own desires, rewriting commandments and parables until every word justified his control. In his eyes, the outside world was a pit of corruption, and only within the walls of his cabin could salvation survive. He called his home a sanctuary, but it was a prison built from fear and delusion. His rules were absolute. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one questioned the word as he read it. The Bible he carried was worn and marked, its pages filled with scribbles and altered verses written in his own hand. He would sit by the fire at night, his voice low and trembling as he preached to his own blood, forcing them to repeat passages that had long since lost their meaning. His sermons were not about mercy or redemption, they were about obedience, purity, and silence. Every act of resistance was branded as sin, every tear a sign of weakness. The family had learned long ago that disobedience was met not with words, but with the heavy swing of his hand or the cruel snap of his belt. The children, if they could still be called that, grew up never hearing laughter. The only sounds that filled the cabin were the rustle of the wind and the patriarch's voice commanding prayers that no one understood. He told them that the world beyond the trees was filled with devils, that strangers carried diseases of the soul, and that their bloodline was chosen to remain pure and untouched by outsiders. To question him was to question God, and that was unthinkable. As the years passed, his madness deepened. He began to see himself not just as the head of the family but as a prophet destined to protect it from the world's evil. When food was scarce or storms destroyed their crops, he called it a test of faith. When his wife begged to leave, he said God had closed the way. And when his granddaughter came of age, he looked upon her not as a child but as a vessel for divine continuation. The family's obedience had turned into worship, and his tyranny had taken on the shape of religion. Within those rotting walls, faith had become the sharpest weapon of all, and the man wielding it no longer knew where belief ended and damnation began. The winter she disappeared was the coldest the valley had seen in decades. Snow fell endlessly, covering the mountains in a white silence that seemed to suffocate every living thing beneath it. The McCree cabin sat buried in that stillness, smoke rising weakly from its crooked chimney, the faint glow of firelight flickering through cracks in the boarded windows. Inside, the family moved like shadows, speaking little, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The girl's mother, a woman whose spirit had long since faded under her father's rule, spent her days staring out at the trees as though searching for a way out that didn't exist. Those who lived nearby said she had once been lively, full of laughter and warmth, but years in that cabin had stripped her of everything except endurance. No one knows exactly when she vanished. Some say it was during a storm that swept through one night, winds howling like something alive, rattling the doors and tearing branches from the forest. Others believe she slipped away quietly, after the old man had fallen asleep by the fire, his Bible resting on his lap. What's known for certain is that when morning came, she was gone. Her bed was empty, the blankets cold, and the door slightly ajar despite the snowdrifts piled against it. The grandfather searched the cabin in a fury, shouting her name, his voice echoing through the hollow like thunder. He accused the others of betrayal, claimed the devil had taken her, and ordered them to pray until their voices cracked. Days later, a hunter passing through the valley found a trail leading from the cabin to the creek that ran half-frozen at the mountain's base. The snow along the path was disturbed, marked by dragging footprints and something darker, streaks of blood, faint but unmistakable. Near the edge of the water, tangled in the ice, was a torn piece of fabric, a shawl the color of faded wine. The hunter took it to town, but when the sheriff went up to question the family, the cabin was sealed tight, smoke still curling from the chimney as if nothing had happened. The old man said his daughter had gone to be with God, that she had been taken by his will, not by the hands of men. No one dared challenge him. After that winter, no one saw her again. The snow eventually melted, and the creek ran red for days after the thaw, though the townsfolk refused to speak of it. The girl, left without a mother, became quieter, her eyes darker. Something in her changed, as though she understood even then that in that cabin, disappearance was not an escape, it was a warning. When the girl turned 13, the air inside the cabin seemed to change. The fire burned lower, the shadows grew longer, and the grandfather's sermons took on a new, unsettling tone. He spoke often about purity and destiny, about how God had chosen their family to carry forth a sacred bloodline untouched by the corruption of outsiders. The words dripped from his mouth like venom disguised as scripture. To him, her coming of age was not a passage into childhood's end, it was the beginning of what he called divine duty. He began to watch her differently, his eyes lingering too long, his words heavy with meaning she couldn't yet understand but instinctively feared. He told her that she was blessed, chosen to preserve their lineage in a way no other could. He said the world beyond the ridge was full of decay, that strangers were filled with sin, and that their kind must remain separate to stay pure. The girl didn't comprehend the sickness buried within those words, she only knew that the tone in his voice no longer sounded like protection, it sounded like possession. When she asked about her mother, he told her she had failed her purpose, that God had taken her away for disobedience. The message was clear: if she resisted, the same fate awaited her. The nights grew longer after that. He began to isolate her even more, sending the younger ones to sleep early while he preached to her alone by candlelight. His hand would rest on the Bible, but his gaze never left her. He told her that she carried the family's salvation within her body, that through her would come a child to restore what was lost. She sat frozen, unable to move, her heartbeat loud in the silence between his words. The old man's faith had long since rotted into madness, and now that madness had found its vessel. The day he declared her chosen, the mountains were shrouded in fog so thick the cabin seemed to float in it, cut off from the rest of the world entirely. He anointed her forehead with oil and recited verses that didn't exist in any Bible. The others in the cabin looked away, too frightened to speak, too broken to stop him. From that moment, she stopped being a granddaughter in his eyes. She became something else, a symbol of his delusion, a tool for the continuation of a bloodline already poisoned by sin. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath that night, as if it too understood what horror was about to unfold within those walls. It happened on a night when the mountains were swallowed by darkness and rain beat against the cabin roof like fists from the sky. The old man had kept her inside for days, forbidding anyone to leave or speak. The others moved silently through the rooms, their faces hollow, their eyes cast to the floor as if afraid to acknowledge what was coming. Then, sometime after midnight, the silence broke. The first scream tore through the stillness, sharp and desperate, echoing through the valley like the cry of something not quite human. Those who lived near enough to hear it never forgot the sound. It was raw and endless, the kind that doesn't fade but lodges itself in the mind. Inside that cabin, a child was being born into a world that had already damned it. The girl lay on the floorboards, drenched in sweat and terror, her small body trembling with every wave of pain. The old man knelt beside her, his hands steady, his expression eerily calm. He murmured verses under his breath, words that should have brought comfort but instead filled the air with dread. He told her to be strong, that this was God's will, that her suffering was holy. The others huddled in the corners, too afraid to help, too broken to intervene. There was no midwife, no doctor, no prayer strong enough to cleanse what was happening in that room. Only the sound of rain, the girl's gasping breath, and the patriarch's voice rising in fervent praise as life forced its way into the world. When the crying stopped, the silence was worse than the screams. The old man lifted the newborn, its tiny body slick with blood and shadow, and held it high as though presenting it to heaven. The girl stared through him, her eyes glassy and distant, her mind already slipping away. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest for a single moment, trees bending under the storm, the cabin glowing faintly in the flash like a wound exposed. The neighbors who saw that light said it felt unnatural, as though the earth itself recoiled from it. By morning, the storm had passed, and the valley was quiet again. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, carrying a smell that didn't belong, something burnt, something foul. Those who dared approach the ridge found the cabin sealed tight, the windows dark, and a cradle rocking slowly by itself in the open doorway. No one ever saw the child again. Some say the old man buried it in the woods before dawn, others that he kept it hidden inside, convinced it was the chosen one. But one thing all the stories agree on: from that night forward, no laughter, no song, and no prayer ever came from that cabin again. Years passed before anyone dared to approach the McCree cabin again. The land had reclaimed much of it by then, the roof sagging under moss and rot, vines creeping through the windows like fingers. Hunters avoided that ridge, calling it the Hollow of Silence, because no birds sang there, no animals nested near the clearing, and even the wind seemed to lose its voice among those trees. But one autumn, a stranger, a hunter from a neighboring county, lost his trail while tracking deer and stumbled upon the forgotten homestead. The forest was thick with decay, the air heavy and damp, and he felt the unmistakable sense of being watched long before he saw the cabin itself. He described it later as something that didn't belong to this world. The door hung crooked, the walls bowed inward, and the wood was scarred with deep scratches that looked almost deliberate. Stepping inside, he found the place frozen in time. Dust coated everything, thick and undisturbed, yet the air felt wrong, too cold, too still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The hunter noticed remnants of a life abruptly abandoned, a cracked mirror resting against the wall, a chair turned over near the fireplace, and a child's toy carved roughly from wood lying beside a rusted cradle. The cradle was the thing that unsettled him most. It rocked gently, though there was no wind, no open window, no reason for it to move at all. He lit his lantern and shone it across the floor. Strange symbols were carved into the planks, circles, crosses, and jagged lines forming patterns that seemed more ritual than random. On the far wall, beneath years of grime, he saw what looked like a family portrait scratched directly into the wood. The faces were crude but distinct: a man, a woman, a girl, and something else beside them, a smaller figure with twisted limbs and hollow eyes. The longer he stared at it, the more it seemed the carved eyes followed him. He backed away, but his boot caught on something metallic. Reaching down, he pulled a rusted tin box from beneath the floorboards. Inside were photographs, blackened with age but still visible. They showed faces distorted by birth defects, hands joined in unnatural ways, eyes reflecting the same madness that once ruled the cabin. The hunter fled before dawn, leaving the box behind. He told his story in town, his voice shaking, but few believed him. Those who did urged him never to return. They said some homes are not built to shelter life but to contain what should never have been born. And from that night onward, no hunter ever set foot near that ridge again. In the small mountain town that lay at the edge of the valley, the story of the McCree family was treated like a wound everyone knew existed but refused to touch. People remembered the screams that had once echoed through the trees and the thick black smoke that sometimes drifted down from the ridge, but when asked, they claimed to know nothing. It was an unspoken rule among the townsfolk: never speak of the cabin, never ask about the family, and never, under any circumstance, go near that part of the woods after dark. Silence became their way of survival. It wasn't ignorance that kept their lips sealed, it was fear. The kind that lingers for generations and passes from parent to child like a ghost story disguised as a warning. Old men sitting outside the general store would fall quiet whenever the topic surfaced, their eyes drifting toward the mountains with the same uneasy respect one might give to a grave. They'd tell outsiders that some places in Appalachia are better left forgotten, that certain stories don't belong to man but to the land itself. There were whispers, of course, about the night a local sheriff had gone up to investigate the family's disappearance and returned a different man, pale and trembling, unable to speak for weeks. He left town soon after, and no one ever replaced him. Some claimed he'd seen something he couldn't explain, others said he'd gone mad. But no one asked questions. Even decades later, that fear never faded. Children were warned to stay away from the ridge, told that the forest up there didn't breathe right. Hunters who ignored the warnings came back changed or didn't come back at all. A few travelers reported seeing a faint light in the distance, flickering like a candle deep in the woods, though everyone knew the cabin had long since rotted away. They said the light moved, following anyone who dared get too close, until the watcher turned back in terror. And those who didn't, those who kept going, were never seen again. The air in town carried a weight whenever the wind blew from the ridge, bringing with it a faint odor no one wanted to name. It wasn't the scent of decay, exactly, but something older, something unnatural. Locals would close their windows, latch their doors, and pretend not to notice. They learned long ago that acknowledging what lurked beyond those trees was an invitation. So they stayed silent, prayed harder, and taught their children to forget what their grandparents still remembered. But the silence never erased the truth, it only buried it deeper. And in that valley, buried things have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Over the years, the story of the McCree family twisted and shifted, transforming in the telling until it became something more than a warning. It became legend. What had once been a tale of isolation and cruelty mutated into whispers of something monstrous, something that might still walk the hollows under the cover of mist. Children told each other about the girl who bore a child by her grandfather, though the details grew more grotesque and exaggerated with every retelling. Hunters, loggers, and wandering travelers all claimed to have glimpsed figures moving between the trees, shadowy forms that vanished when approached but left behind the unmistakable sense of being watched. The story was no longer just about the past, it had a pulse, a life of its own, and it fed on fear. Some locals swore that the child she bore had survived, hidden somewhere deep in the mountains. It was said to roam the woods in the dead of night, a creature with the face of the girl and the eyes of her grandfather, moving silently between the hollows as though the forest itself were guiding it. Farmers reported finding their livestock mutilated, their fences torn down in patterns too precise to be the work of animals. Travelers spoke of hearing footsteps following them on empty trails, of whispers carried on the wind that repeated their own fears back to them. The story became a cautionary tale, not just of human cruelty but of the unnatural, of what happens when bloodlines are twisted and isolation breeds monstrosity. Even those who dismissed the tales could not deny the feeling that lingered when fog settled over the mountains. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was always watching from just beyond the edge of sight. Photographs surfaced occasionally, old and blurred, showing figures with unsettling features, faces that seemed almost familiar, yet wrong in ways that made the stomach tighten. The deeper one delved into the history of the McCree family, the more the legend seemed to infect reality itself, as if the mountains remembered, as if the valley itself refused to let the story die. Folklore, in this place, became indistinguishable from truth. Every missing child, every strange sound in the night, every inexplicable animal attack was quietly linked to the McCree legacy. People would nod knowingly, lower their voices, and remind one another that some families are better left forgotten, that some valleys are better left unvisited. The legend evolved into a living shadow, a presence as real as the trees and the fog. And while decades passed and the cabin decayed into nothing but memories and twisted timber, the whispers never stopped, warning anyone who would listen that the child, the girl, the bloodline, whatever it was still out there, waiting, watching, and moving through the hollows, unseen but never gone. Decades after the McCree cabin had fallen into ruin, curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth led an archaeological team into the valley, unaware of the centuries of fear that still clung to the place. They came equipped with modern tools and instruments, confident that science could illuminate the mysteries the locals refused to speak of. The team followed the remnants of trails long overgrown and pushed through thickets where the trees leaned close together, their branches forming unnatural arches that seemed to warn them away. As they approached the clearing where the cabin had once stood, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, as if the valley itself were pressing in on them. They began their excavation near the foundation, carefully lifting layers of soil and debris. At first, they found ordinary remnants, old tools, fragments of pottery, a few rusted nails, but then their trowels hit something denser. Digging deeper, they unearthed a small grave, its wooden sides rotted away, but its shape still. Inside lay bits of bones intertwined in a way that was both shocking and impossible to ignore. One was adult, large and knuckled with age, the other small, fragile, unmistakably that of a child. Both skeletons bore the same peculiar deformities, unusual curvature of the spine, irregularity in the skull, anomalies that suggested a shared bloodline and a history of inbreeding. The discovery sent a chill through the team, and the air seemed to press closer, heavy with the weight of untold stories. Artifacts around the grave told an even darker story. Scattered among the bones were scraps of fabric, brittle, blackened by time, etched with symbols that had been carved into the wood of the cabin itself. There were remnants of ritualistic objects, small wooden carvings, half-burnt candles, and stones arranged in precise circles, as if marking the spot for something both sacred and profane. It became clear that this was not merely a grave, it was a record of generations twisted by isolation, superstition, and the tyranny of one man. The adult skeleton was unmistakably the patriarch, the man who had ruled the cabin with a terrifying mix of faith and madness. The smaller skeleton, tragically, appeared to be his granddaughter's child, the very offspring of the forbidden union that had haunted the valley for decades. Word of the discovery spread slowly, at first confined to academic circles, but the locals already knew the truth. They had never spoken of it openly, but their warnings, whispered over generations, had been real. The valley had preserved its secrets, hiding the evidence of horror until someone disturbed it. Even now, long after the excavation, people who pass through the hollows report strange sounds, glimpses of shadows moving between the trees, and an uneasy feeling that the valley remembers that it holds within its soil the echoes of lives that were never meant to exist, bound together forever in death as they had been in life.